Imagine standing on a rocky coastline somewhere along what we now call Lebanon, around 3,000 years ago. The air is thick with salt and something else. Something foul, actually. A sharp, rotting smell that clings to your clothes and your hair and doesn't leave for days. All around you, thousands of tiny snail shells are piled into enormous heaps, each one cracked open, each one discarded after yielding just a single drop of something precious. A drop so small you could barely see it. A drop that, once exposed to sunlight, would transform slowly, impossibly, from pale yellow to green to a blazing, luminous purple that no painter alive today can fully replicate. You're standing in the middle of the most profitable industrial operation the ancient world had ever seen, and the men running it are not warriors or kings or priests. They are merchants, sailors, dyers, shipbuilders, and they are about to build an empire not with armies but with colour. This is the story of the Phoenicians, arguably the most underappreciated civilization in all of ancient history. A people who never called themselves Phoenicians at all, who left no grand temples to themselves, no towering monuments bearing their own names, and yet who wired the entire Mediterranean world together with trade routes, alphabets, and a substance so rare and so extraordinarily expensive that it would become the defining colour of royalty across 3 continents for more than 1,000 years. The colour was called Tyrian purple. The civilization that produced it had no standing army to speak of, and yet at their height, their commercial reach stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic coast of what is now Morocco and Portugal. They founded Carthage, one of the greatest cities the ancient world ever produced. They circled Africa by ship more than 2,000 years before the Portuguese tried the same journey. They may have reached the British Isles. Some scholars have argued with more evidence than you might expect that they reached the Americas, and it all started with snails. In this video, we're going to follow the full arc of Phoenician civilization, from its origins in the Bronze Age cities of Canaan, through the discovery and industrialization of their purple dye, through the establishment of a trading empire that would shape the ancient world in ways we are still living with today. We will walk through the streets of Tyre and Sidon, board their ships, stand in their dye workshops, and follow the purple cloth as it moved from the coast of Lebanon to the palaces of Egypt, Assyria, Greece, and Rome. We will watch their civilization survive conquest after conquest, while slowly passing their greatest gifts, their alphabet, their navigation techniques, their commercial networks, to the cultures that absorbed them. And we will trace how those gifts became the invisible foundations of the world we inhabit right now. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet, and thank you for being here, now. Let us begin at the beginning, which, as is so often the case in ancient history, is considerably stranger and more complicated than anyone tells you in school. To understand the Phoenicians, you first have to understand the world they were born into, because it was a world that should not, by any reasonable expectation, have produced such a remarkable civilization. The eastern coast of the Mediterranean, the stretch of land that modern maps label Lebanon, with slivers of what is now northern Israel and coastal Syria attached to either end, is not generous territory. It is a narrow strip of coastal plain, rarely more than a few kilometres wide, backed almost immediately by the rugged ridges of the Lebanon mountains, which rise steeply to heights approaching 3,000 metres and are snow-capped for much of the year. There is not much flat, arable land here. There is not much room to grow grain at scale. There are no vast river systems to irrigate the interior the way the Nile irrigated Egypt or the Tigris and Euphrates irrigated Mesopotamia. By the logic of ancient agricultural civilization, this coast should have been a backwater, a marginal zone populated by fishing communities and small farming villages, overshadowed by the great empires that rose and fell on either side of it. Instead, it became one of the most consequential pieces of real estate in human history, and the reason why is interesting, because it was not despite the mountains that this happened. It was, at least partly, because of them. The mountains of Lebanon contained something the ancient world desperately wanted, and that was cedar wood. Not just any cedar, Lebanese cedar, Cedrus libani, which grew to extraordinary sizes and produced timber that was, by the standards of the ancient world, nearly miraculous. It was durable without being brittle. It resisted rot. It was fragrant, which meant it also repelled insects. It was straight-grained enough to cut into long, consistent planks and beams, and it was abundant enough in those early millennia to be harvested at scale. The Egyptians had virtually no timber worth mentioning. Egypt is a desert civilization built on riverine agriculture, not forests. And so from the earliest periods of recorded history, Egyptian pharaohs sent ships north along the coast to buy Lebanese cedar for their temples, their palace roofs, their funeral barges, their coffins, and critically their warships and trading vessels. The correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and the kings of Byblos, one of the oldest of the Phoenician city-states, extends back to at least 3000 BCE, and possibly earlier, making it one of the longest continuously documented trade relationships in human history. Byblos itself is worth pausing on, because it is one of those places that accumulates significance like sediment. It sits on a promontory above the Mediterranean, about 40 kilometres north of modern Beirut, and it has been continuously inhabited for somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 years, making it one of the oldest continuously occupied cities on Earth, a claim it contests with Jericho and a handful of other ancient sites in a competition that archaeologists continue to argue about with impressive vigour. The Egyptians called it Kebni, the Greeks called it Byblos, and from that name we eventually get the Greek word for book, biblios, because Byblos was the primary port through which Egyptian papyrus was exported to the Greek world. From biblios we eventually get the word Bible. So the city whose harbour traffic gave us the word for the most widely read book in Western history was itself named, etymologically, after the writing material it traded in, which was produced in a completely different country, and the city's own inhabitants called it something else entirely. This is how etymology works when you follow it through 3,000 years of commerce and cultural exchange. The people who lived in Byblos and in the other coastal cities that would eventually be grouped under the label Phoenician, Sidon, Tyre, Arwad, Berytus, which is modern Beirut, Sarepta, and several others, did not, as I mentioned, call themselves Phoenicians. That name comes from the Greeks, and it appears to derive from the Greek word phoenix, which means, depending on which scholar you ask, either purple red or dark red, or possibly crimson, all of which are reasonable descriptions of the dye that these people produced and which made them famous throughout the Mediterranean. The people themselves used the names of their individual cities. They were Tyrians, Sidonians, Giblists, from Byblos, Arwadites. They shared a language, a broadly similar culture, similar religious practices, similar shipbuilding and commercial traditions, and they clearly had extensive contact and commerce with one another. But they never formed a unified political state and would likely have been puzzled by the idea of being called Phoenicians as a group. The label is a Greek imposition, and a useful one for historians, but it papers over a more complex reality of city-state autonomy and sometimes fierce inter-city rivalry. Their language, which we call Phoenician, belongs to the northwest Semitic branch of the Semitic language family, making it a close relative of ancient Hebrew, so close that for much of their early history Phoenician and Hebrew were essentially dialects of the same language, mutually intelligible and sharing most of the same vocabulary and grammatical structures. Both languages were written in a script that would eventually become the most consequential writing system in human history, but we will get to that in its own time. For now, what matters is the world these people inhabited during the Late Bronze Age, roughly 1550 to 1200 BCE, and the position they occupied within it. That world was one of surprising interconnection. The great powers of the Late Bronze Age, Egypt, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Assyrian state in northern Mesopotamia, the kingdom of Mitanni, the Aegean palace cultures of Mycenae and Minoan Crete, were all in sustained diplomatic and commercial contact with one another, trading not just goods but ideas, technologies, craft traditions, and diplomatic correspondence written on clay tablets in the Akkadian language, which served as the lingua franca of Bronze Age international relations, in roughly the same way that English serves that role today. The Phoenician city-states occupied a central position in this web because they sat at the intersection of the major sea lanes and overland routes connecting Egypt to the north and the Aegean to the west. Goods from sub-Saharan Africa arrived in Egyptian ports, moved north along the coast through Phoenician hands, and dispersed from there to the Aegean, to Cyprus, to the Hittite coast. Metals, copper from Cyprus, tin from somewhere in the east or northwest, gold from Egypt and Nubia, circulated through this system in quantities that modern archaeology has only recently begun to appreciate fully. The most vivid single snapshot of this Bronze Age commercial world is a shipwreck. In 1982, a Turkish sponge diver named Mehmet Shakir reported seeing what looked like metal biscuits scattered on the seabed near the town of Uluburun on the southern coast of Turkey, at a depth of about 44 to 61 meters. Archaeologists from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology subsequently spent 11 seasons excavating what turned out to be one of the most astonishing archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. A late Bronze Age merchant ship that had sunk around 1300 BCE while sailing along the coast, probably on a route that connected the eastern Mediterranean to the Aegean. The ship's cargo was staggering in its variety and quantity. There were 10 tons of copper ingots in the distinctive oxhide shape that Bronze Age merchants used, each one roughly the size and shape of a stretched animal skin, with handles at the corners for easier carrying. There were 1 ton of tin ingots. There was a ton of terebinth resin in Canaanite jars, used for incense and perfume. There was ebony from sub-Saharan Africa. There was ivory, both elephant ivory and hippopotamus ivory. There was glass in raw ingot form, in colours including cobalt blue, turquoise and lavender. There were Canaanite jars filled with olives, with pomegranates, with spices. There was an entire set of balance weights from 4 different cultural traditions: Egyptian, Syro-Palestinian, Aegean, and a 4th unidentified system, suggesting that the merchant on this ship was prepared to conduct business in at least 4 different commercial cultures, each with its own measurement standards, and among the cargo there were dye materials, murex shells. Not in large quantities, this was not primarily a dye ship, but their presence tells you something about how thoroughly the purple dye trade had already penetrated the commercial networks of the Bronze Age Mediterranean by 1300 BCE. The Uluburun ship was not a Phoenician vessel in any simple sense. The exact cultural identity of its crew and owners is debated, but it sailed through a world that the Phoenician cities helped to organize and sustain, and it illustrates perfectly the kind of dense, multilateral, long-distance commercial network within which Phoenician merchants operated, and which they would eventually come to dominate so thoroughly that the Roman world 600 years later would still be using commercial institutions, trade routes and measurement systems whose origins lay in Bronze Age Canaan. Then, around 1200 BCE, everything fell apart. The Bronze Age collapse is one of the great unsolved mysteries of ancient history. Between approximately 1200 and 1150 BCE, virtually every major palace culture in the eastern Mediterranean was destroyed or severely disrupted. The Mycenaean palaces of mainland Greece, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, were burned and abandoned. The Hittite Empire, which had contested Egyptian power for control of the Levant and fought the famous Battle of Kadesh to a grinding standstill, simply ceased to exist as a political entity. Ugarit, the great cosmopolitan city-port on the Syrian coast, that was in some ways the most sophisticated urban centre of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, was destroyed and never rebuilt. Cyprus, which had been producing copper on an industrial scale, was disrupted and depopulated. Even Egypt, the most durable of the Bronze Age states, lost its imperial reach and retreated into a period of internal fragmentation. The trade networks that had connected all of these civilizations, the networks exemplified by the Uluburun ship, collapsed along with the states that had sustained them. What caused this? Historians and archaeologists have been arguing about it for more than a century, and the honest answer is that we do not know for certain, and may never know fully. The ancient sources mention invasions by a group called the Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders who attacked coastlines from Anatolia to Egypt, who appear in dramatic Egyptian relief carvings at Medinet Habu, showing naval battles and land engagements of extraordinary scale. But the Sea Peoples were almost certainly a symptom as much as a cause. Modern scholarship increasingly points to a combination of factors operating simultaneously. Climate change, specifically a prolonged drought that archaeological evidence now confirms struck the eastern Mediterranean around this period. Systems collapse, in which interconnected trade networks proved catastrophically fragile when one or more nodes failed. Internal political disruptions and revolts, and yes, migrations and raids by displaced populations, including the Sea Peoples, who were themselves perhaps refugees from the same climatic and political disruptions they were blamed for causing. Whatever the exact sequence of causes, the result was a transformation so thorough that historians speak of a genuine dark age descending on the Aegean and the broader Mediterranean world. Writing disappeared from Greece for roughly 4 centuries. The Linear B script used by the Mycenaean palace, bureaucracies vanished along with the palaces it had served, and the Greeks who emerged on the other side of the collapse in the early Iron Age had to borrow an alphabet from somewhere else to write again, which is a detail we will return to. Trade contracted dramatically. Long-distance commerce became difficult and dangerous. Population appears to have fallen sharply in many regions, and yet, in this catastrophic rubble, something remarkable happened to the Phoenician cities. They survived, not all of them unscathed. Ugarit was destroyed, and some of the Canaanite coastal cities were disrupted. But the core Phoenician cities, particularly Byblos, Sidon and Tyre, survived the Bronze Age collapse better than almost any other urban culture in the Mediterranean, and in the fragmented, disrupted world that followed, they found themselves in a position of extraordinary opportunity. Think about what the collapse had done to the commercial landscape. The Mycenaean palace states, which had organised long-distance trade in the Aegean and been major consumers of eastern luxury goods, were gone. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated the trade routes through Anatolia, was gone. Ugarit, which had been a major competitor for the trade flowing through the Levantine coast, was gone. Egypt was weakened and inward-looking. The old commercial networks had collapsed, but the underlying need for the goods those networks had moved — metals, timber, textiles, dyes, spices, luxury goods of all kinds — had not. Whoever could rebuild those networks would essentially be operating in a space cleared of its most powerful competitors. The Phoenicians rebuilt them, and in doing so they built something qualitatively different from what had come before, not the palace-centered, state-directed commerce of the Bronze Age, but a more flexible, decentralized, entrepreneurially driven commercial culture that proved far more resilient and expansive than the system it replaced. The key figure in this story, or rather the key city, is Tyre. Tyre had existed as a Bronze Age port, but it was in the Iron Age that it rose to its greatest prominence, becoming the wealthiest and most powerful of the Phoenician cities and the one most responsible for the explosive expansion of Phoenician commercial reach across the Mediterranean. Tyre's physical situation was extraordinary. It occupied a small island a short distance offshore, which gave it an almost impregnable natural defensive position. The city was effectively impossible to capture without a substantial fleet, which most potential conquerors in the early Iron Age did not have. This security allowed Tyrian merchants and ship captains to invest in long-distance voyaging, without the constant fear of having their home city destroyed by a land-based army while they were away. The Tyrian kings of the early Iron Age were formidable political operators, the most famous of them, Hiram I, who ruled roughly from 981 to 947 BCE, appears in both Phoenician and biblical sources as the man who essentially invented the classical Phoenician commercial empire. It is Hiram who appears in the biblical accounts of the construction of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, supplying cedar wood and skilled craftsmen. The Phoenicians were renowned throughout the ancient world as the best carpenters, metal workers, and ivory carvers of their age, in exchange for grain and olive oil, which the thin soils of the Lebanese coast could not produce in sufficient quantity to feed a growing urban population. This exchange between Hiram and Solomon is described in detail in the first book of Kings, and while the biblical account has obvious theological purposes and should be read with appropriate critical caution, the underlying commercial relationship it describes is entirely consistent with what archaeology tells us about the Phoenician city's needs and capabilities in this period. Hiram also undertook substantial engineering works at Tyre itself, linking a second island to the main city and expanding its harbour facilities to accommodate the growing fleet that Tyrian commerce required. He was, by all accounts, an energetic and visionary ruler who understood that the Phoenician city's prosperity depended on their commercial reach, and who invested systematically in expanding that reach. Under his rule and his successors, Tyrian trading posts and eventually permanent colonies began to appear along the major sea routes of the Mediterranean, in Cyprus, in Sicily and Sardinia on the coast of North Africa, eventually in Spain and possibly beyond. But none of this expansion would have been possible without the commodity that gave the Phoenicians their Greek name, their wealth, their mystique, and their strangest industrial operation. It was time, in the story of Tyre's rise, for the purple dye industry to shift into high gear. The story of Tyrian purple dye begins, as so many great stories do, with something disgusting. The dye was produced from a marine mollusk, specifically from two species of predatory sea snail that lived in the shallow coastal waters of the eastern Mediterranean. The primary species were Balinus brandaris, known as the spiny dye murex, and Hexaplex trunculus, known as the banded dye murex, with a third species, Stramonita hemastoma, also sometimes used. These are not particularly impressive creatures in their living state. The spiny dye murex, as its name suggests, has a shell covered in sharp projecting spines and looks somewhat like an undersea porcupine frozen in calcium carbonate. The banded dye murex is smaller and rounder, its shell marked with alternating bands of brown and white. They feed on other shellfish, boring through shells with their radula, a rasping tongue-like organ, or, in the case of the spiny dye murex, occasionally prying bivalves open directly. They are, in short, perfectly ordinary predatory sea snails, distinguished from thousands of other mollusks only by a single extraordinary biological accident. They produce a substance that, when processed correctly, yields a colour of almost supernatural beauty and permanence. The substance in question is produced by a gland called the hypobranchial gland, also sometimes called the purple gland, which sits near the snail's head. In living snails, the secretion from this gland is initially colourless or pale yellow. Its biological function is not entirely agreed upon by zoologists. It may serve as an anesthetic for prey, or as a repellent against predators, or both. What is agreed upon is what happens to it when it is exposed to air and sunlight. It undergoes a series of chemical transformations, passing through yellow, then green, then blue, and finally settling into the brilliant reddish-purple colour that made Phoenician dyers wealthy beyond the imagination of most of their contemporaries. The chemical compound responsible for this colour is 6,6-prime-dibromoindigo, a molecule that is chemically very similar to the indigo used to dye blue jeans today, but with 2 bromine atoms substituted into its structure in positions that shift its light absorption toward the red end of the spectrum. This molecular similarity to indigo is not a coincidence. Both compounds belong to the same chemical family, and both are produced by organisms as byproducts of their metabolic chemistry. But the bromine atoms in 6,6-prime-dibromoindigo give it properties that ordinary indigo lacks. It bonds to wool fibres with extraordinary tenacity, forming what chemists call a covalent bond rather than the looser physical attachment of most dyes. This means that Tyrian purple, once properly applied, does not fade. It does not wash out. It does not bleach significantly in sunlight. Ancient garments dyed with Tyrian purple have been found in archaeological contexts buried for 2,000 years, and the colour is still visible. The cloth fades, rots, and disintegrates, but the colour, where it survives, retains remarkable intensity. No synthetic dye discovered before the mid-19th century could match this combination of brilliance and permanence. The production process was as unpleasant as it was profitable. The snails were gathered in enormous quantities using baited traps. The Phoenicians apparently used other shellfish as bait, or possibly rotting fish, which may have attracted the predatory murex effectively. Once collected, the snails were processed in one of 2 ways. The simpler method involved cracking the shell, cutting out the hyperbranchial gland, and collecting its secretion directly into vessels, where it would be left to undergo its colour transformation. The more industrially efficient method involved simply crushing the snails entirely and allowing the mass of shell fragments and tissue to ferment together, which extracted the dye-producing compounds more efficiently, if considerably more odorously. The fermentation process produced a smell that was, by all ancient accounts, literally nauseating. Ancient writers describe it consistently and with a vividness that suggests genuine trauma. The fermenting mass of crushed mollusks, decomposing tissue, and extracted dye compounds apparently reeked of rotting seafood at an intensity that made the areas around dye workshops nearly uninhabitable by anyone not engaged in the work. This is why dye workshops were consistently located at the edges of ancient Phoenician cities, preferably downwind. The industrial districts of Tyre and Sidon, and later of Carthage and other Phoenician colonies, were placed where the prevailing sea breezes would carry the smell away from the urban centre. Archaeological excavations at these sites have revealed the characteristic debris of the dye industry. Enormous midden heaps of crushed murex shells, sometimes tens of metres across and several metres deep, representing hundreds of millions of individual snails killed over centuries of dye production. This is the other remarkable and slightly sobering fact about Tyrian purple. It required an almost unimaginable number of snails. Ancient sources and modern experimental archaeology broadly agree that you needed something on the order of 10,000 to 12,000 snails to produce 1 gram of pure dye. Some estimates push even higher. A single gram of pure Tyrian purple dye would cost, in ancient terms, roughly equivalent to its weight in silver, and the price only went up as you climbed the quality ladder. The most prized grades of Tyrian purple were made from a smaller proportion of the dye snail population and involved additional processing steps that further concentrated the colour and intensified its depth. The absolute highest quality, described in ancient sources as the colour of dried blood or as resembling the colour of the sea just before a storm, could sell for prices that put it beyond the reach of everyone except kings, emperors, and the very wealthiest merchant families. The labour and infrastructure involved in this industry were correspondingly enormous. Fishing fleets had to harvest the snails from coastal waters across a broad range, eventually extending to the western Mediterranean as the eastern Mediterranean populations were depleted by intensive harvesting. Processing facilities had to manage thousands of kilograms of raw mollusks at a time. Dyeing the actual cloth, which involved multiple immersion steps in the dye bath, drying, and re-immersion to deepen the colour, required skilled workers who understood how to control the chemistry of the process, which involved not just the dye compound but various mordants and reducing agents that affected the final colour. The specific techniques were trade secrets, passed down within dyer families, and guarded with the kind of corporate jealousy that modern technology companies devote to their source code. One particularly fascinating aspect of the dye's chemistry is its versatility. By varying the process, specifically by controlling the degree of exposure to light during the colour development phase, and by adjusting the composition of the dye bath, Phoenician dyers could produce a range of colours that went well beyond simple purple. Cloth could be dyed a deep crimson red, or a bright scarlet, or a blue that rivaled lapis lazuli, or the classic reddish purple that modern colour charts would call something like wine or burgundy. This range meant that Phoenician dye workshops were not limited to supplying one market niche, but could produce luxury textiles across a spectrum of colours that commanded premium prices in every market they served. There is even evidence that the dye could be used on its own to produce blues that some scholars believe may have been the famous biblical blue called techelet, which Jewish law required to appear on the fringes of prayer, shawls, and which was lost to history sometime in the early medieval period when the Roman prohibitions on purple dye production disrupted the industry so thoroughly that the knowledge of which species to use and how to produce the blue variant was forgotten. There has been a remarkable modern effort to reconstruct techelet, and the leading candidate for the original source is indeed Hexaplex trunculus, the banded dye murex, essentially the same species the Phoenicians used for their purple. The social meaning of all this chemistry was as important as the chemistry itself. Purple was not merely a colour in the ancient world. It was a statement. It was, for most of antiquity, a colour that carried with it the weight of divine authority, royal power, and wealth so extreme that it verged on the sacred. When Homer describes the gods wearing purple robes in the Iliad, he's using purple as a shorthand for divinity. When ancient Near Eastern kings dressed in purple, they were not simply making a fashion choice. They were making a political and theological claim about their relationship to divine power. The colours' associations were so thoroughly intertwined with legitimate authority that many ancient legal codes restricted the wearing of purple to specific classes of people, and in the Roman Empire at its height, the wearing of Tyrian purple by anyone other than the emperor was a capital offence. This is what is meant by the phrase, to be born in the purple. Byzantine emperors were literally born in a room called the porphyra, the purple chamber, to establish their claim to legitimate authority from the first moment of their existence. All of this cultural weight, all of this symbolic power, all of this divine authority, it all flowed back along the trade routes to the dye workshops of Tyre and Sidon, where men who smelled permanently of rotting shellfish were doing the least glamorous industrial work imaginable and making fortunes doing it. You cannot understand the Phoenician commercial empire without understanding their ships, because their ships were as much a technological achievement as the purple dye was a chemical one. The Phoenicians did not invent sailing. People had been sailing the Mediterranean since the Neolithic, but they refined it, systematized it, and pushed it far beyond anything that had been done before in their era. Phoenician ships came in two basic types, which corresponded to their two primary maritime functions: trade, and, when necessary, defence. The merchant vessel was the merchant ship, a broad-beamed, deep-hulled craft with a single mast carrying a large square sail, designed to maximise cargo capacity rather than speed. Ancient images of Phoenician merchant ships preserved on Assyrian palace reliefs and Greek vases show vessels with a distinctive rounded hull, a raised stern curving back over the deck, and a ram at the prow. They typically had a crew of perhaps 20 to 30 men, who would row when the wind failed, sleep on deck without any significant shelter, and carry cargo in the ship's hold as well as on the open deck. These were not comfortable vessels. Long-distance voyaging in them was genuinely arduous. Days and weeks at sea with no protection from the elements, dependent entirely on the skill of the captain and the knowledge accumulated by generations of Phoenician navigators about the winds, currents, stars, and coastal landmarks of the Mediterranean. The warship, the long ship as ancient sources call it, contrasting it with the round merchant vessel, was a different creature entirely, narrow, fast, low in the water, powered primarily by oarsmen arranged in rows, with a vicious bronze ram at the waterline designed to hole enemy vessels below the deck. The Phoenicians built warships for several of the great empires they came into contact with. The Persians used Phoenician fleets extensively during their military campaigns, including the famous Persian wars against Greece, and Phoenician shipwrights and sailors crewed many of the vessels that fought at Salamis in 480 BCE, and they developed the galley design in ways that would directly influence the Greek trireme and, through that, the Roman warships of the Punic Wars. The two vessel types worked together in Phoenician commercial operations. Merchant ships carried the goods. Armed escorts protected them on the more dangerous routes. Occasionally the same vessel could serve both purposes. Armed merchantmen were common throughout ancient maritime commerce, because the line between trader and pirate was contextual rather than categorical. A Phoenician captain encountering a weaker vessel in a remote stretch of sea might trade with it, raid it, or both, depending on circumstances. This moral flexibility was not unique to Phoenicians. It characterized ancient maritime commerce generally, but it contributed to the mixed reputation that Phoenicians had among their Greek contemporaries, who admired their commercial skill while also accusing them of being kidnappers and swindlers. Homer's Odyssey contains multiple unflattering references to Phoenician traders, and Herodotus opens his histories with the claim, presented somewhat skeptically, that the original cause of the conflict between Greeks and Persians was Phoenician merchants kidnapping women from Greek ports, including, in one version of the story, Io herself. The navigation techniques that made long-distance Phoenician voyaging possible are worth examining in some detail, because they represent a genuine intellectual achievement that is easy to underestimate if you think of it simply as sailing by the stars. Phoenician navigators did sail by stars, but the specific techniques they used, and the knowledge of coastal geography, seasonal wind patterns and current systems that they accumulated over centuries, constituted a sophisticated body of applied science. They were particularly, associated in ancient sources with the use of the pole star, Polaris, for navigation, and they were apparently more willing than their Greek contemporaries to sail at night and to cross open sea out of sight of land. The Greeks referred to the pole star as the Phoenician star, which tells you something about the cultural association between Phoenician sailors and its use. The ability and willingness to sail out of sight of land, to strike boldly across open water rather than hugging the coastline and making port every night, as was the norm for most ancient Mediterranean navigation, was what made the Phoenician expansion westward possible. Crossing the central Mediterranean, rounding the toe of Italy, passing through the straits between Sicily and North Africa, or making the long haul from the eastern Mediterranean to Sardinia or the Spanish coast. All of these required navigators who were comfortable with open sea passages lasting days or weeks, who could read the sky, the sea, the colour of the water, the presence of seabirds, and 100 other subtle environmental cues to maintain course and estimate position. This knowledge was accumulated slowly, passed from father to son, and from experienced navigator to apprentice over generations, and it was among the most valuable intellectual property the Phoenician cities possessed. One of the most astonishing applications of Phoenician navigational skill is described by Herodotus in a passage that scholars argued about for centuries and that modern evidence has largely vindicated. Herodotus writes that the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II, who reigned from approximately 610 to 595 BCE, commissioned a Phoenician fleet to circumnavigate Africa. According to Herodotus, the expedition succeeded, taking approximately 3 years to complete. The fleet sailed south from the Red Sea, rounded what we now call the Cape of Good Hope, and returned through the Strait of Gibraltar to the Mediterranean. The detail that Herodotus says he personally found hard to believe but included anyway is the one that makes modern scholars most confident the story is essentially true. The Phoenician sailors reported that as they sailed around the southern tip of Africa, the sun was on their right side, which is to say to their north. Herodotus, writing from the perspective of someone who lived in the northern hemisphere and had never been south of the equator, could not understand how this could be. We know perfectly well how it could be. South of the equator, the sun's path crosses the sky to the north. The Phoenician sailors had noticed this disorienting geographical fact and reported it accurately. A story invented in a Mediterranean context would not have included this detail. Its inclusion is powerful evidence that something very close to what Herodotus describes actually happened. If the circumnavigation of Africa occurred around 600 BCE, it means that the Phoenicians completed a journey that the Portuguese, in their famous Age of Discovery, took until 1488 to replicate, and that the Phoenicians did it in wooden-oared galleys, without magnetic compasses, without sextants, without any of the navigational instruments that the Portuguese had available to them. It is an achievement that deserves to be far better known than it is. The ships and their navigation, in combination with the purple dye and the cedar trade, were the 3 legs on which early Phoenician commercial dominance rested. But as the Iron Age progressed and the Phoenician cities pushed further and further westward, they needed something more than ships and routes and trade goods. They needed permanent bases, places where ships could shelter, where supplies could be replenished, where goods could be stored, and merchants could negotiate without making the full journey back to the Levantine coast every time. They needed, in other words, colonies. The Phoenician colonial expansion across the Mediterranean is one of the most extraordinary stories of ancient history, and one of the least celebrated in popular culture. Between roughly 1000 and 600 BCE, Phoenician merchants and settlers established a network of trading posts, way stations and permanent settlements that stretched from the shores of Cyprus in the east to the Atlantic coasts of Spain and Morocco in the west, a distance of roughly 5,000 kilometres as the crow flies, across some of the most challenging and variable sailing conditions the Mediterranean offers. The expansion happened in stages, following the logic of commercial necessity. The first wave moved westward along the natural stepping stones of the central Mediterranean. Cyprus, which was already well known to Phoenician merchants as a source of copper, received Phoenician settlers in several of its ports, most notably Kition on the southeastern coast, where Phoenician presence is archaeologically attested from at least the 9th century BCE and possibly earlier. From Cyprus, the routes continued westward to Crete, Rhodes, and the Aegean Islands, then curved up toward the Italian peninsula and southwest towards Sicily. Sicily became one of the most important theatres of Phoenician colonial activity in the central Mediterranean. The Phoenicians, or more specifically the Tyrians and Sidonians, established settlements at several points on the western end of the island, most notably at Panormus, modern Palermo, Soluntum, and Motia. Motia deserves special attention because it is one of the best preserved Phoenician sites in the world, a small island in a lagoon on the western tip of Sicily that was connected to the mainland by a causeway, giving it the same kind of defensive island geography that made Tyre so secure. Excavations at Motia have revealed a densely built city with sophisticated infrastructure, a harbour, a topet, a sacred precinct about which more shortly, industrial facilities, and a remarkable residential architecture that shows the full complexity of Phoenician urban life. The site was eventually destroyed by the Syracusan tyrant Dionysius I in 397 BCE during one of the many Phoenician-Greek confrontations in Sicily, but its archaeology has survived sufficiently well to give us a genuinely vivid picture of what a middle-sized Phoenician colonial city actually looked like. Sardinia, the large island west of Italy, was another major centre of Phoenician colonial activity. The island had been inhabited since the Bronze Age by a people known as the Nuragic culture, who built the remarkable stone tower structures called nuraghi that dot the Sardinian landscape in their thousands. The Phoenicians established trading relationships with the Nuragic Sardinians initially, then founded permanent settlements at coastal sites, including Caralis, modern Cagliari, Nora, Sulcis, and Tharos. These sites exploited Sardinia's mineral resources, particularly its lead and silver deposits, and served as staging posts for voyages further west. The real prize, though, was the far western Mediterranean, specifically the Iberian Peninsula, which we now call Spain and Portugal, and its mineral wealth. The ancient sources describe a legendary place called Tartessos, somewhere in the vicinity of what is now the Guadalquivir river valley in southern Spain, as a fabulously wealthy kingdom rich in silver, gold, copper, and tin. Whether Tartessos was a single unified kingdom or a looser cultural complex is debated, but the mineral wealth of southern Iberia is not in question. It was real, it was immense, and it was what drew Phoenician merchants across the full length of the Mediterranean to establish what ancient sources identify as some of the oldest Phoenician colonial foundations in the West. Gaidir, known to the Romans as Gades and to us as Cadiz, was founded, according to ancient tradition, around 1100 BCE, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe if the traditional date is accepted. Modern archaeology has been frustratingly unable to find occupation layers that definitively date to 1100 BCE. The modern city sits on top of the ancient site and makes deep excavation difficult, but Phoenician material dating to at least the 9th century BCE has been found in the region, and the ancient traditions of extreme antiquity are consistent with the commercial logic of the time. Gadir's location is extraordinary. It sits just outside the Strait of Gibraltar on the Atlantic coast of Spain, giving it access to both the Mediterranean trade system and the Atlantic, a position of almost unparalleled strategic commercial value. From Gadir, Phoenician merchants could access the Atlantic tin routes that connected Iberia to Cornwall and Brittany, and could trade with peoples along the Atlantic coast of Africa and Europe who were entirely outside the Mediterranean commercial system. The mining operations that Phoenician merchants helped to organize in southern Iberia were industrial in scale. The silver mines of the Rio Tinto Valley in what is now the province of Huelva. Huelva sits near the Guadalquivir's mouth, in the heart of ancient Tartessos, produced silver in quantities that astonished ancient visitors. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, describes Phoenician merchants arriving in Iberia and finding silver so abundant that the local people were using it for household implements, including storage vessels that a Mediterranean merchant would have been likely to make from clay or bronze. Whether or not this specific detail is accurate, The archaeological evidence for intensive silver extraction in the region during the period of Phoenician contact is overwhelming. The slag heaps from ancient smelting operations at Rio Tinto are still visible today, and modern analysis has confirmed that the peak of ancient silver production at the site corresponds closely with the period of heaviest Phoenician commercial activity. The tin trade was equally important. Bronze, the dominant metal of the preceding age and still widely used in the early Iron Age for weapons, tools and prestige objects, requires tin, and tin was one of the scarcest and most geographically concentrated metals in the ancient world. The primary sources were the Iberian Peninsula, Brittany in northwestern France, and Britain, particularly Cornwall, which was known to ancient traders as the Cassiterides, the Tin Islands. The Phoenicians and their successors, the Carthaginians, guarded the routes to these tin sources with ferocious commercial jealousy, and there are stories in ancient sources of Phoenician ship captains deliberately grounding their vessels rather than allowing Greek competitors to follow them to the tin sources. Whether these specific stories are true is uncertain, but the general pattern of Phoenician information control about Western Mediterranean and Atlantic trade routes is well established. Meanwhile, back in the centre of the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians had planted their most consequential colonial seed. Around 814 BCE, according to ancient tradition, a group of Tyrian colonists founded a new city on a peninsula on the North African coast, roughly where modern Tunis now stands. They called it Carthage, the new city. We know it as Carthage. The founding legend of Carthage is one of the most beautiful and melancholy stories in all of ancient history, and like most founding legends, it contains a kernel of historical reality wrapped in layers of later mythological elaboration. The story centres on a woman named Elissa, known to the Romans as Dido, who was a Tyrian princess, sister of the Tyrian king Pygmalion. According to the tradition preserved by several ancient sources, including most famously Virgil in the Aeneid, though the story predates Virgil by centuries, Pygmalion had murdered Elissa's husband Sychaeus, or Acabas depending on the source, to seize his wealth. Elissa, warned of the conspiracy, fled Tyre with a group of loyal followers and the treasure that her husband had concealed. The fleet crossed the Mediterranean and eventually landed on the coast of what is now Tunisia, where Elissa negotiated with the local Berber king, named Iapbas in most versions, for as much land as could be covered by an ox hide. Here the legend takes a turn that suggests someone in antiquity had a very good legal mind. Elissa had the ox hide cut into the thinnest possible strips and arranged these strips in a circle on a hill overlooking the sea, thereby encompassing an area of land that was considerably larger than any reasonable interpretation of the original bargain. The hill was called Byrsa, which means hide in Greek, and on it the Carthaginians built their citadel. This is clearly a folk etymology invented to explain a place name, but it is a charming one, and the image of Elissa on that hill, methodically cutting the hide into strips and measuring out the perimeter of her future empire with strips of leather, has a quality that keeps it alive in the imagination 3,000 years after the event it purports to describe. The historical reality behind the legend is likely something like this. Around the end of the 9th century BCE, a group of Tyrian settlers, probably driven by some combination of political conflict at home and commercial opportunity abroad, established a permanent settlement on the Tunisian coast at a location that was extraordinarily well suited to maritime commerce. The site occupied a peninsula with harbours on both sides, facing north toward the sea lanes of the central Mediterranean, with access to fertile agricultural hinterland and proximity to the important island of Sicily. From this position, a maritime trading state could potentially control the flow of commerce between the eastern Mediterranean, the western Mediterranean, and the Atlantic routes through the Strait of Gibraltar, which is precisely what Carthage eventually did, though the process took centuries. For most of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Carthage was simply a prosperous Phoenician colonial city, subordinate to Tyre and contributing to the Tyrian commercial network. It sent tribute to Tyre. Its religious practices, its language, its architecture, its commercial institutions were all essentially Tyrian transplants, modified gradually by the new environment and by contact with the Berber peoples of the North African hinterland. The gods worshipped in Carthage were the same gods worshipped in Tyre, principally Baal Hammon, a sky and fertility deity, and Tanit, a goddess whose cult eventually came to overshadow Baal Hammon's in Carthaginian religion, and who is depicted on thousands of Carthaginian votive stelae as a distinctive schematic figure, a triangle surmounted by a disc and topped by a circle, almost universally recognized today as the symbol of Carthage. Then, in the middle of the 6th century BCE, Carthage's relationship to the mother city changed dramatically. In 539 BCE, the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and effectively absorbed the entire Near Eastern world into the Persian Empire. Tyre, which had managed to maintain its autonomy under Neo-Assyrian pressure through a combination of political skill and the impracticality of besieging an island city without a fleet, now found itself in a different and more complex political situation as part of the Persian Empire. Carthage, far away on the other side of the Mediterranean, was beyond Persian reach entirely and gradually asserted its independence and its own imperial ambitions. The key historical moment was Carthage's repudiation of the tribute payments to Tyre that it had traditionally made, a step that represented a declaration of economic and political independence. At roughly the same time, Carthage began actively organizing and leading the Western Phoenician colonial network, rather than simply participating in it. The Phoenician cities of Sicily, Sardinia, and Iberia gradually came under Carthaginian leadership and protection, creating a Western Phoenician sphere that was politically distinct from the Eastern Phoenician cities under Persian influence. Carthage's transformation from prosperous colony to Western Mediterranean superpower was accelerated by the conflict with the expanding Greek world. Greek colonists had been moving westward since the 8th century BCE, establishing settlements throughout Sicily, in southern Italy, which became so densely Greek in population that the Romans called it Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, on the French Mediterranean coast at Massalia, modern Marseille, and even on the Spanish coast at Emporion, modern Empúries in Catalonia. The Greek and Phoenician colonial spheres were expanding toward each other, and collision was inevitable. The conflict focused particularly on Sicily, where Greek settlements on the eastern end of the island faced Phoenician settlements on the western end, with the centre of the island as a contested zone. There were Greek attempts to push westward and Phoenician attempts to push eastward. Periodic wars, truces, and further wars through the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. The most decisive early confrontation came in 480 BCE, the same year that the Persian wars were reaching their climax at Salamis and Thermopylae. A Carthaginian general named Hamilcar led a massive expedition against the Greek Sicilian cities. Ancient sources give troop numbers that are certainly exaggerated, but the scale was genuinely large, and was defeated by the Syracusan tyrant Gelon at the Battle of Himera. According to later Greek tradition, including a dramatic and probably apocryphal story told by Herodotus, Hamilcar threw himself into the sacrificial fire during the battle when he saw it was going against him, though the prosaic reality is that he likely simply died in the fighting. The defeat at Himera was a serious blow to Carthaginian ambitions in Sicily, but Carthage recovered, and the wars in Sicily continued for another 2.5 centuries, eventually pulling in Rome as well when the city on the Tiber was expanding its own power across the Italian peninsula and beginning to look at Sicily with imperial interest. The Punic Wars, the three great conflicts between Rome and Carthage that would eventually determine which civilization would rule the Mediterranean, were in many ways the final, catastrophic installment of a conflict that had been building since the first Greek colonist and the first Phoenician trader looked across a stretch of water at each other and understood that they wanted the same thing. But before we reach the Punic Wars and the terrible end of Carthage, we need to spend time with Carthage at its height, understanding what it actually was as a civilization, what made it exceptional, and why its destruction has been one of the great historical controversies of the Western tradition since the Renaissance. At its height, in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, Carthage was one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the Mediterranean world. Ancient sources describe a city of several 100,000 inhabitants. Some estimates push to 500,000, with a double harbour of extraordinary design. The outer harbour was the commercial harbour, a large rectangular basin where merchant ships loaded and unloaded. Behind it, connected by a narrow channel, was the inner harbour, the Kothon, as ancient sources call it, which was the military harbour, circular in shape with a central island housing the admiral's headquarters and capable of accommodating, according to the ancient sources, something like 220 warships simultaneously in covered ship sheds around its circumference. The geometric regularity of this harbour design, one circular basin nested behind one rectangular basin, with carefully calculated access channels, is the kind of infrastructure that speaks of sophisticated engineering planning and serious state investment in naval power. The city's domestic architecture was notable for multi-storey apartment buildings. Ancient sources mention buildings of 6 and 7 stories, which implies both a dense urban population and a construction technology more sophisticated than is often associated with ancient cities outside of Rome. The Carthaginians had extensive suburbs stretching along the peninsula, large cemeteries in the Phoenician tradition, and a necropolis, a city of the dead essentially, that archaeologists have excavated extensively, and that has yielded thousands of carved stelae and votive objects documenting the religious life of ordinary Carthaginians. And then there is the Tophet. This is among the most contested and disturbing questions in all of ancient history, and it deserves careful handling. Every Phoenician city and every major Phoenician colonial settlement had a precinct called a Tophet. The word itself is of uncertain etymology. It appears in the Hebrew Bible in a clearly negative context as a place of burning, and what happened in these precincts is one of the most passionately debated questions in the archaeology of the ancient world. A Tophet is a sacred open-air enclosure filled with urns, thousands of urns. The urns contain the cremated remains of small children, predominantly infants and young children under the age of 2 or 3, though older children and occasionally adults are also represented, along with the cremated remains of young animals, particularly lambs and kids, along with votive offerings, carved stelae with inscriptions and sometimes amulets and small figurines. The stelae frequently carry inscriptions that have been interpreted as recording votive offerings, made to the gods Belhammon and Tanit in fulfillment of vows, the classic structure being something like to Belhammon and Tanit, this offering that name vowed. The classical interpretation of these sites, based on what ancient Greek and Roman sources say about Phoenician and Carthaginian religious practice, is that they are the physical evidence of child sacrifice, that Phoenician parents, particularly in times of crisis or in fulfillment of religious vows, sacrificed their own children by burning them and deposited the remains in the Tophet. Ancient sources including Diodorus Siculus, Plutarch, Cleitarchus, and others describe Carthaginian child sacrifice in graphic terms, and the Roman rhetorical tradition treated it as the defining mark of Carthaginian barbarism, a proof of the fundamental otherness and moral inferiority of the enemy. The word immolation itself carries its etymological roots in this tradition, the counter-argument which has gained considerable scholarly support since the 1970s and particularly since the 1980s is that the Tophet sites represent not sacrifice, but rather a specialized infant cemetery, that the children whose remains are deposited there died from natural causes, particularly premature birth, stillbirth, and infant mortality in the first years of life, which were catastrophically high in the ancient world, and that the Tophet was simply the appropriate sacred space for the burial of children who died before some threshold of social personhood. On this interpretation, the animals buried alongside the children were substitution sacrifices, offered to the gods in the child's name, either in thanksgiving for a birth, in mourning for a death, or both. The inscriptions that seem to record votive fulfillment could, on this reading, record the offering of the animal rather than of the child. The debate has been intense, sometimes bitter, and has involved sophisticated analysis of the skeletal remains to determine the causes of death, the statistical distribution of ages, and the demographic patterns of the population represented. More recent analysis, including isotopic studies and microscopic bone examination, has pushed back toward the original interpretation to some extent, suggesting that at least some proportion of the children in these deposits did not die from natural causes. The current scholarly consensus, to the extent that there is one, seems to be that the reality was complex, that the Tophet represented multiple different practices that changed over time, that some deposits represent natural deaths, and some represent intentional sacrifice, and that the ancient polemic against Carthaginian child sacrifice was not entirely fabricated, though it was certainly exaggerated and weaponized for propagandistic purposes. What is striking about this entire controversy is how thoroughly it has been shaped by the fact that Carthage lost. The Punic Wars ended with the complete destruction of Carthage by Rome in 146 BCE, a destruction so thorough that the city was physically demolished and the site was symbolically cursed, though the later story that the Romans salted the earth to prevent agriculture is almost certainly a medieval invention rather than a historical fact. With Carthage destroyed, virtually the entire Carthaginian literary and intellectual tradition was lost. We have not a single work of Carthaginian literature, history, philosophy, or science, with the partial exception of a surviving text on agriculture attributed to a Carthaginian writer named Mago, which was translated into Latin and thus survived the city's destruction. Everything we know about Carthage comes from its enemies, from Greek and Roman writers who had strong political and rhetorical reasons to depict Carthage in the worst possible light, and from the mute evidence of archaeology, which can tell us what was deposited in the Tophet but cannot by itself tell us the full story of why. This epistemological problem, knowing a civilization only through the writings of its conquerors, is not unique to Carthage, but it is particularly acute here because the stakes of the Roman portrayal were so high. Carthage was demonized by Roman writers not simply because it was an enemy, but because it had been a genuinely dangerous one. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who crossed the Alps with war elephants in 218 BCE and spent 16 years campaigning in Italy, came closer to destroying Rome than any other enemy before the Germanic invasions of the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. The trauma of Hannibal, of watching a Carthaginian army march through the Italian countryside for over a decade, winning battle after battle while Rome's allies defected and the city feared for its survival, was profound and lasting. The Romans who eventually destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE were, in some sense, still afraid of it, even after it had been stripped of its empire and its navy and reduced to a shadow of its former power. The elder Cato's habit of ending every speech in the Roman Senate with "Carthage must be destroyed," regardless of the speech's subject, is almost a perfect illustration of this fear, the compulsive repetition of a man who is not entirely convinced himself that the danger is past. The destruction of Carthage was followed almost immediately by the regret of those Romans who had opposed it, most notably the younger Scipio Aemilianus, the general who commanded the final siege, who reportedly wept as the city burned and quoted Homer on the fall of Troy, saying that he feared the same fate would someday befall Rome. That self-aware guilt, expressed in the moment of the city's annihilation, suggests that even the Romans who destroyed Carthage understood that they were doing something that would haunt the historical record. And so it has. Carthage, more than almost any other destroyed civilization, continues to generate passionate, historical debate about what it was, what it represented, and what the Mediterranean world lost when it burned. We have been talking for some time now about the material achievements of Phoenician civilization. The purple dye, the ships, the colonies, the harbours, the commercial networks. But the most important thing the Phoenicians ever created, the gift that has proven most durable and most transformative, was not made of cloth or timber or dye. It had no weight and no smell and no colour. It was a system of signs, and it changed the way human beings think, the Phoenician alphabet. Let us be precise about what this was and why it mattered so much. Writing had been invented multiple times and independently in human history by the point when the Phoenicians developed their script, around the 11th or 10th century BCE. The Sumerians had cuneiform, the Egyptians had hieroglyphs, the Chinese had a character-based system, the Indus Valley civilization had a script that we still cannot read. The Mycenaean Greeks had Linear B, a syllabic script derived from the Minoan Linear A. All of these writing systems shared a common characteristic. They were complex. Learning to write in any of them required years of dedicated study, typically at the hands of professional scribes who jealously guarded their expertise as a form of social power. In ancient Mesopotamia, scribal training took approximately 12 years. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing used several hundred signs in its simplified forms and over 700 in its full elaboration. Linear B used about 90 syllabic signs plus numerous logograms and was apparently so difficult that it was mastered only by palace bureaucrats who used it exclusively for administrative record-keeping. There is no evidence of Linear B being used for literature, personal correspondence, or any purpose except recording grain inventories and tax obligations. The Phoenician alphabet was different in a way that is hard to overstate. It had 22 signs, that is all, 22 marks, each corresponding to a single consonant sound. The key vowels were not written at all, which seems strange to modernize but works surprisingly well for Semitic languages, whose grammatical structure is built on consonantal roots that carry the core meaning while vowel patterns express grammatical relationships. A reader of Phoenician who knew the language could supply the correct vowels automatically from context, just as a reader of English can correctly read the sti anthem as the cat sat on the mat if they know the language. 22 signs. Compare that with the thousands of characters required for Chinese, or the hundreds of cuneiform signs for Akkadian, or the hundreds of Egyptian hieroglyphs. 22 signs could be learned in days rather than years. They required no professional scribal class to transmit. Any merchant, any sailor, any craftsperson could learn them in a few weeks of practice. They could be written quickly on almost any surface. Clay tablets, papyrus, leather, stone, metal, wood, with a simple stylus or a brush. They democratized literacy in a way that no previous writing system had done, and in doing so they democratized access to recorded knowledge, to long-distance communication, to legal contracts, to commercial records, to the entire infrastructure of literate civilization. The Phoenician alphabet was not, strictly speaking, invented by the Phoenicians from scratch. It belongs to a family of alphabetic scripts that developed in the Bronze Age Levant, probably from a creative engagement with Egyptian hieroglyphs, and whose earliest known form is the so-called Proto-Sinaitic script, found in inscriptions at the turquoise mines of Serabit el-Qadim in the Sinai Peninsula, dating to around 1850 to 1550 BCE. The workers at these mines appear to have been Canaanite-speaking Semites, who invented or adapted a consonantal alphabet using Egyptian hieroglyphic signs as their models, taking the Egyptian sign for house, for instance, and using it to write the sound B because the Canaanite word for house was Beth, whose first consonant was a B sound. This acrophonic principle, using the first sound of the depicted object's name to give the sign its phonetic value, is how most of the letters of the Phoenician alphabet, and therefore of the Greek alphabet, and therefore of the Latin alphabet, and therefore of every alphabet descended from Latin, including the one you're reading in right now, got their phonetic values. From the Proto-Semitic script, a series of related scripts developed throughout the Levant during the Late Bronze Age, including the Ugaritic cuneiform alphabet, which used cuneiform wedges but organized them alphabetically, and the Canaanite linear alphabets, of which Phoenician is the most historically prominent descendant. The Phoenician version of this script stabilized into a consistent, clearly defined 22-letter alphabet sometime around 1050 to 1000 BCE, and from that point it spread with remarkable speed. The mechanism that spread was, of course, Phoenician commercial contact. Wherever Phoenician merchants established trading relationships, their alphabet followed. The Aramaeans, the Semitic-speaking people who occupied the interior of Syria and who eventually spread across much of the Near East as merchants, diplomats, and settlers in their own right, adopted a version of the Phoenician alphabet and used it to write Aramaic, which became the lingua franca of the Near East under the Persian Empire and remained widely used throughout the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Iran for centuries thereafter. The Hebrew alphabet, in which the Old Testament and the Torah were eventually recorded, is a direct descendant of the Phoenician alphabet, so closely related that the early forms of the letters are nearly identical. Arabic script, in which the Quran is written, is a descendant of Aramaic, which is a descendant of Phoenician. The Syriac and Coptic scripts have similar roots. The alphabets of South and Southeast Asia, Brahmi and its descendants, which eventually gave rise to scripts used for Sanskrit, Hindi, Tamil, Tibetan, Thai, Khmer, Lao, Burmese, and dozens of other languages, may well derive ultimately from the Phoenician alphabet via trade routes through Persia and Arabia, though this remains debated. But the most consequential transmission of all was westward, to the Greeks. Sometime in the 9th or 8th century BCE, the exact date is debated, with estimates ranging from 900 to 750 BCE, Greek speakers adopted the Phoenician alphabet. The evidence for the adoption is unambiguous. The Greek letters are unmistakably derived from Phoenician letter forms. Greek letter names are borrowed from Phoenician, alpha from aleph, beta from beth, gamma from gimel, delta from daleth. The Phoenician words for ox, house, throwing stick, and door, reflecting their acrophonic origins. And the order of the letters in the alphabet is the same. The Greeks adapted the system brilliantly to their own language by repurposing several Phoenician consonant signs that represented sounds that Greek lacked, the aleph, ayin, he, war, and yod, as signs for vowels, thereby creating the first fully phonemic alphabet, one that represents both consonants and vowels systematically. This innovation, which the Greeks may not have fully recognized as revolutionary, meant that Greek could be written and read without any ambiguity or need for contextual interpretation, a complete phonetic record of spoken language. From Greek, the alphabet passed to Etruscan, to Latin, to the Germanic runic systems, to Cyrillic, invented by Saints Cyril and Methodius in the 9th century CE, to write Slavic languages based on Greek letters, and through these lineages to virtually every alphabet currently used in Europe, the Americas, and much of the rest of the world. Somewhere between 2 and 3 billion people currently use alphabets that descend directly in an unbroken chain of transmission from the writing system that Phoenician merchants carried with them on their ships across the Mediterranean 3,000 years ago. The Phoenicians almost certainly had no idea that this is what they were giving to the world. For them, the alphabet was a commercial tool, a fast, efficient way to keep records and communicate over distance. When they scratched their letters on potsherds, inscribed them on bronze bowls and carved them on stone monuments, they were doing accounting, writing dedications and recording property. They were not thinking about philosophical literature or epic poetry, or the legal codes of future empires, or the religious texts of faiths not yet founded. And yet all of those things, and more, followed from the alphabet they spread. It is perhaps the most consequential gift one civilization has ever given to another without intending to. The Phoenician cities did not exist in a political vacuum, and their survival through 3,000 years of Near Eastern history is itself a story worth telling carefully. They were surrounded for most of their existence by empires whose military power dwarfed anything the Phoenician cities could field. Egypt to the south, the Assyrian Empire to the east, Babylon after Assyria, Persia after Babylon. Each of these was a military superpower capable of rolling over the Phoenician coast with overwhelming force, and each of them, at various points, did exactly that. And yet the Phoenician cities continued. The purple dye kept flowing, the ships kept sailing, the trade kept moving. How? The answer reveals something profound about the nature of power and resilience in the ancient world. The Phoenician cities survived not by resisting the great empires, but by being useful to them, by providing goods and services that the empires wanted and could not easily get elsewhere, and by making that usefulness so indispensable that destroying the Phoenician cities would have been economically self-defeating for any rational conqueror. Egypt's relationship with the Phoenician coast, as we have seen, extended back to the very beginning of recorded history, and the Egyptians needed the Phoenicians more than the Phoenicians needed them, in commercial terms at least. Timber, luxury goods, access to the trade routes of the northern Mediterranean, all of these flowed through Phoenician intermediaries. The Egyptian New Kingdom pharaohs maintained elaborate diplomatic relationships with the Canaanite coastal cities, and the Amarna letters, the famous archive of Bronze Age diplomatic correspondence found in Egypt in the late 19th century, include extensive correspondence between Egyptian officials and the rulers of Byblos, documenting a relationship that was more genuinely bilateral than the Egyptian texts alone might suggest. The rulers of Byblos were culturally Egyptianized to a remarkable degree. They wrote to the pharaoh in Akkadian but used Egyptian, hieroglyphic inscriptions in their own monuments, and adopted Egyptian religious imagery extensively. And yet they negotiated with Egypt from a position of genuine commercial strength. The Assyrian Empire presents a more complex picture. The Assyrians were among the most brutal military powers the ancient world produced. Their annals record campaigns of systematic terror, mass deportation, and deliberate destruction of cities, all depicted in the matter-of-fact prose of an empire that used atrocity as a deliberate tool of governance. Tyre and the Phoenician cities are mentioned repeatedly in Assyrian records from the 9th century BCE onward, usually in the context of tribute payments, the Phoenician kings paying substantial quantities of silver, purple cloth, cedar timber, and luxury goods to Assyrian kings in exchange for being left alone. The reliefs of Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud show Phoenician tribute bearers carrying the characteristic products of their civilization: purple cloth, metal bowls, carved ivory, and the scale of the tribute recorded in Assyrian texts suggests both the wealth of the Phoenician cities and the terms on which that wealth was preserved. There were, of course, periods of resistance. The siege of Tyre under the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V, and his successor Sargon II at the end of the 8th century, BCE lasted 5 years, which is a remarkable testament to Tyre's island fortifications. The Assyrians, formidable on land, had no effective navy until they drafted Phoenician and Cypriot sailors to build one, and even then the island geography of Tyre made a complete blockade extraordinarily difficult. The city eventually submitted and paid tribute rather than falling by assault. A century later, under Esarhaddon, Tyre was besieged again, this time more successfully, but even then the city was not destroyed. It was too valuable. The Assyrian kings wanted the tribute, the purple, the ships, the commercial networks. Destroying Tyre would have been like killing the golden goose, and even the most brutal ancient military empire could usually recognize when destruction was not in its economic interest. The most famous siege of Tyre is the one that falls outside the Phoenician period proper, but cannot be omitted from any telling of Tyre's story. The siege by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE. This confrontation is remarkable for several reasons, not least because it was the only siege in Alexander's entire career that seriously challenged his capacity for military engineering and strategic persistence. Alexander's army had swept through the Persian Empire with bewildering speed. Issus, Granicus, the fall of Egypt. And when he arrived at Tyre and demanded that the city surrender and allow him to offer sacrifice at the famous temple of Melkart, the chief god of Tyre, whom the Greeks identified with Heracles, he presumably expected the kind of quick capitulation that most cities had offered him. Tyre refused. The Tyrians had assessed their situation and concluded that their island position, combined with their powerful fleet, made them defensible. Alexander, they calculated, had no navy worth mentioning. The Persian fleet was still at large in the Mediterranean, and besieging an island city without ships was logistically absurd. They were, in every conventional sense, correct. Alexander responded by building a causeway. He set his entire army to the task of constructing a mole, a solid artificial land bridge, from the mainland to the island, approximately 1/2 kilometre across the shallow coastal strait. This project, which sounds straightforward in summary, and was in practice a nightmare of engineering, logistics and improvisation, took 7 months to complete. The Tyrians sortied against it repeatedly, using fire ships, divers who cut the ropes of construction equipment, and every naval asset they could deploy. Alexander, who had pressed Cypriot and other Eastern Mediterranean fleets into service as his siege operations naval component, fought back. The causeway crept forward, was partially destroyed, was rebuilt. Alexander brought up siege towers mounted on the causeway. The Tyrians developed countermeasures. Alexander countered the countermeasures. When the city finally fell after those 7 months, Alexander's response was as total as anything the Assyrians had done. Around 8,000 Tyrians were killed in the final assault and its aftermath. Another 2,000 were crucified along the beach, an act of deliberate theatrical cruelty designed to demonstrate the cost of resistance. And 30,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The Temple of Melkart, the access to which had been the formal casus belli, was presumably left standing, since Alexander was characteristically careful about honouring local religious sites. The historical irony of the Tyre causeway is that it still exists. The silt and sediment accumulation around it over the subsequent 23 centuries has turned what was once an island into a peninsula, and modern Tyre, the Lebanese city of Sur, sits on land that is partly Alexander's engineering project, hardened by millennia of natural accretion into something that looks entirely organic. The siege that was supposed to be impossible left a physical trace visible from satellite imagery today. But for the Phoenician cities in the period before Alexander, the dominant experience of relations with great empires was not conquest and destruction, but accommodation and negotiation, a sophisticated dance of commercial usefulness and political flexibility that allowed small cities with no significant standing armies to survive and even thrive in a world of overwhelming military powers. The Phoenicians paid tribute, supplied ships and sailors to imperial navies, provided luxury goods that fed the appetite of imperial courts, and continued doing exactly what they were best at: building ships, harvesting snails, dyeing cloth, sailing to distant ports and selling things. When the Persians replaced the Babylonians, who had replaced the Assyrians, the Phoenician cities adapted. They served the Persian fleet in the Aegean campaigns against the Greeks. Phoenician ships and Phoenician sailors were the backbone of Xerxes' navy at Salamis, and if the Greek version of that battle had gone differently, if the tactical intuitions of Themistocles had failed, or the Athenian fleet had been outmaneuvered, history would have pivoted on a Phoenician axis. They fought on the losing side at Salamis, but they survived its aftermath, returned to their cities, and went back to the business that had sustained them for centuries. It was this astonishing resilience, this capacity to survive anything by making themselves indispensable, that most distinguished the Phoenicians among the civilizations of the ancient world. They were not, ultimately, unconquerable by force. Alexander proved that. But they were almost unconquerable by economics, because the things they made and did and knew were too valuable to simply erase from the world. When Rome destroyed Carthage and absorbed the former Phoenician heartland of the Levant into its empire, it might have seemed that the Phoenician story was over. The cities continued. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos remained important ports under Roman rule, but as provinces of an empire rather than as the centres of an independent commercial civilization. The purple dye continued to be produced, but now under Roman regulation rather than Phoenician commercial monopoly. The trade routes continued, but now organised within the framework of Pax Romana rather than by the independent commercial calculations of Tyrian merchants. And yet the Phoenician legacy did not disappear. It transformed, dispersed, and embedded itself so deeply in the structures of the civilization that absorbed it that Rome could not have functioned without it. The Roman commercial system that connected Britain to Egypt, Spain to Mesopotamia, the Rhine to the Nile, the system that economists of classical antiquity call the largest market economy the world had seen before the early modern period, was built on foundations that the Phoenicians had laid. The routes, the networks, the commercial practices, the alphabetic writing system, the harbour technologies, the shipbuilding traditions. All of these flowed from the Phoenician world into the Roman world in a transmission that was so thorough and so well integrated that the Romans themselves were largely unaware of how much they owed to the civilization their ancestors had worked so hard to destroy. The purple dye industry under Roman management is a particularly instructive case. The Romans did not invent Tyrian purple. They inherited it, the way they inherited so many things from the Eastern Mediterranean world, through conquest, assimilation, and the practical recognition that the conquered often knew things the conquerors needed to learn. Roman dye workshops were established in the traditional Phoenician locations, Tyre, Sidon, Acre, and the island of Jerba off the Tunisian coast, and continued the industry for centuries, with the dye becoming increasingly entangled with Roman imperial ideology as the purple garment became the literal and figurative mark of imperial authority. The transition from Phoenician commercial product to Roman imperial symbol was not a sharp break but a gradual intensification of associations that had been building since the Bronze Age. The Roman sumptuary laws controlling the wearing of purple are themselves a testament to the dye's continuing commercial significance. If purple cloth had become inexpensive and easily available, there would have been no need to legally restrict it. Sumptuary laws only function when they restrict access to something that people actually want and could, in principle, obtain. The fact that the restrictions became progressively stricter as the empire aged, moving from restricting the full double-dipped purple to any purple to even purple-striped cloth, Mie suggests that availability was actually increasing as production techniques spread, requiring ever more restrictive legal barriers to maintain the colour's elite exclusivity. By the late Empire, wearing certain grades of purple without imperial authorization was literally a capital crime. The end of Tyrian purple as a commercial commodity came not with any dramatic event, but with the slow fragmentation of the Roman imperial system and the disruption of the commercial networks that had sustained the industry. The Arab conquests of the 7th century CE disrupted but did not immediately end the Levantine dye industry. Arab rulers continued to produce and value purple cloth, and the Byzantine Empire, which persisted in Constantinople until 1453, maintained the imperial purple tradition throughout its existence. The Byzantine emperors wore purple, were born in purple chambers, issued documents sealed with purple ink, and maintained workshops producing purple-dyed cloth for ceremonial and diplomatic purposes. When Byzantine emperors sent purple-dyed silk as diplomatic gifts to Western European rulers, Charlemagne received such gifts. They were perpetuating a tradition that stretched back without interruption to the Bronze Age dye workshops of Tyre. The definitive end of the purple tradition in the Eastern Mediterranean came gradually between the 9th and 12th centuries CE as a combination of factors: declining murex populations from centuries of overexploitation, disruption of trade networks, loss of technical knowledge as dyer families died out or dispersed, and the increasing availability of plant-based purple and red dyes that were cheaper if less permanent, eroded the industry's viability. By the 12th century, the art of producing true Tyrian purple from murex snails had been largely forgotten, leaving only the word in the historical record and the insistent symbolic weight of the colour in the heraldic and ecclesiastical traditions that had inherited it. The alphabet, by contrast, did not fade. The Phoenician gift of systematic phonetic writing did not decline or become obsolete. It proliferated and diversified into the most widely used writing technology in human history. By the time Rome fell to the Germanic peoples in the 5th century CE, the Phoenician alphabet had already diverged into Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, and numerous other scripts. It had been carried north to the Germanic tribes as the runic script, probably through contact with the Greek and Latin alphabets. It was being carried east along the Silk Road, giving rise eventually to the Central Asian alphabets, from which many modern scripts of South and Southeast Asia are descended. Within a few more centuries, it would give rise to Cyrillic in Eastern Europe, to the Armenian and Georgian scripts in the Caucasus, and, through Arabic and Persian, to the Urdu script of the Indian subcontinent, the Ottoman Turkish script, and dozens of others. Today, the scripts descended from the Phoenician alphabet are used by somewhere between 3 and 4 billion people daily, writing in languages as diverse as English, Arabic, Hindi, Russian, Hebrew, Greek, Spanish, Swahili, Vietnamese, and dozens of others. The principle that underpins them all, the idea that a small set of signs, each representing a single sound, can represent any spoken language with near-perfect fidelity and can be learned quickly enough that widespread literacy is achievable. This principle was not obvious. It required invention, and the civilization most responsible for its invention and most responsible for its spread was the Phoenician one. The commercial institutions that Phoenician merchants developed and spread are harder to trace, but arguably equally important. The practice of entrepreneurial long-distance private commerce, as opposed to the state-organized palace commerce of the Bronze Age, was refined and systematized by Phoenician merchants and spread through their networks throughout the Mediterranean world. Greek and Roman commercial law, which formed the basis of medieval and eventually modern commercial law in Europe, developed in direct dialogue with the Phoenician commercial traditions that had preceded it. The concept of the business partnership, the commercial loan, the bill of lading, the factoring of risk across multiple investors, All of these institutions, while not necessarily invented by the Phoenicians, were spread and normalized by them in contexts where they became part of the standard commercial toolkit of Mediterranean civilization. The harbour technologies that the Phoenicians developed, artificial harbours, breakwaters, ship sheds, lighthouse systems, were adopted and expanded by Greek and Roman engineers and formed the technological basis of Mediterranean maritime commerce for centuries. The Roman harbour at Caesarea Maritima in Israel, built by Herod the Great in the 1st century BCE using Roman concrete hydraulic construction techniques, was built at a site that had been a Phoenician anchorage, and many of the commercial and administrative functions it served were direct continuations of the functions that Phoenician harbour towns had served in the same location centuries earlier. Perhaps most evocatively, the Phoenician legacy survives in the very names and symbols that modern people use without thinking about their origins. The letter A, which most people in the Western world learned to read first among all the letters of the alphabet, was the Aleph of the Phoenician alphabet, a letter whose name meant ox in the Canaanite language, and whose original form, traced back through the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions to the Bronze Age mining camps of the Sinai, was a drawing of an ox's head, horns and all. Turn the letter A upside down and rotate it slightly, and you can see, just barely, the ghost of that ox's head. The horns become the splayed legs, the crossbar becomes the animal's shoulders. It is a very long way from a Bronze Age Canaanite miner scratching an ox head on a rock in the Sinai, to a modern child learning to write A in a classroom in any of 100 countries, but the line between those 2 points is unbroken, and it runs through the counting houses and the ships and the dye workshops of Tyre and Sidon. The story of how modern scholarship recovered the Phoenician world from millennia of obscurity and selective memory is itself a fascinating tale of archaeology, chemistry, and the stubborn refusal of the physical record to stay buried. For most of the medieval and early modern periods, knowledge of the Phoenicians came almost entirely from 2 sources: the Bible, which portrayed them primarily as the neighbours, and sometimes the corrupting influence of ancient Israel, and the Greek and Roman literary sources, which painted them with a mixture of commercial admiration and moral condemnation. The Phoenicians appeared in these sources as a people of great skill but questionable ethics, superb sailors and merchants who nevertheless cheated, kidnapped, and engaged in barbaric religious practices. This portrait, uncritically accepted by most early modern scholars, was not so much wrong as profoundly incomplete. It was the portrait drawn by competitors and conquerors, and it left out everything that the Phoenicians themselves might have said about who they were. The archaeological recovery of the Phoenician world began seriously in the 19th century, as European scholars and colonial-era excavators turned their attention to the ancient Near East, with a combination of genuine scholarly interest and colonial-era acquisitiveness. The excavations at Byblos by the French archaeologist Ernest Renan in the 1860s opened a window onto the deep antiquity of the city and its connections with Egypt. Later excavations at Tyre, Sidon, Carthage, and the colonial sites throughout the Mediterranean gradually assembled the physical evidence of a civilization that had left far more behind than the ancient literary sources had suggested. The most transformative discovery for the study of Phoenician civilization was probably the excavation of Ras Shamra, ancient Ugarit in Syria, beginning in 1929. Ugarit was not a Phoenician city in the strict sense. It was a Bronze Age Canaanite city that predated the Phoenician period and was destroyed in the Bronze Age collapse. But the thousands of clay tablets found there, written in the Ugaritic cuneiform alphabet, provided the first genuine Canaanite literary texts ever discovered. Mythological epics, religious poems, legal documents, diplomatic correspondence, and commercial records that illuminated the cultural world from which Phoenician civilization emerged. The Baal cycle. a long mythological poem about the storm god, Baal's battles with Yam, the sea, and Mot, death, and his cyclical death and resurrection, transformed our understanding of Canaanite religion and allowed scholars to see how the mythology that the Hebrew prophets were arguing against actually worked and what it meant to those who believed it. The chemistry of Tyrian purple was reconstructed in the late 20th century through a combination of historical research and experimental archaeology. The Israeli chemist Zvi Koren, working at the Shenkar College of Engineering and Design in Tel Aviv, has spent decades studying the chemistry of ancient dyes and has succeeded in identifying Tyrian purple in preserved ancient textiles using spectroscopic analysis, demonstrating that the purple visible in ancient textiles from Masada, from Palmyra, from Roman Egypt is indeed 6'prime dibromoindigo, and not some imitation compound. Meanwhile, experimental archaeologists and traditional craftspeople have reconstructed the production process, gathering living murex snails from Mediterranean waters, extracting the dye compound using techniques derived from ancient descriptions and modern chemical understanding, and dyeing wool using the traditional multi-immersion method. The results of these reconstructions are stunning. The colour produced by experimentally dyed wool using murex-derived dye is precisely what ancient descriptions suggest: a deep, luminous, reddish purple that shifts in different lights between warm crimson and cooler violet, that seems to glow with an internal light, and that, this is always the first thing experimenters mention, smells absolutely terrible during production. Every modern researcher who has gone through the process of extracting and using Tyrian purple reports the same experience. You understand viscerally why the ancient dye workshops were placed downwind of the cities, and you understand equally viscerally why the people who endured that smell for the sake of the product they made were paid so well. The archaeological evidence for the geographical extent of the murex shell middens has been supplemented in recent years by underwater archaeology, which has found evidence of ancient dye production at offshore sites, and has traced the extension of the industry along routes that the literary sources hint at but do not explicitly document. The island of Djerba off the Tunisian coast, identified by ancient sources as an important centre of purple production, has yielded extensive underwater deposits of murex shells consistent with industrial-scale dye production. Similar deposits have been found along the Israeli coast at Haifa, Acre, Athlit, and several other sites. The cumulative picture is of an industry whose geographical footprint extended across hundreds of kilometres of coastline and whose total output, while impossible to quantify precisely, was sufficient to supply the luxury textile needs of the entire Mediterranean world for more than a millennium. One of the most unexpected modern developments in the Phoenician story is the ongoing effort to reconstruct the lost biblical blue known as techelet. Jewish law in the books of Numbers requires that a thread of techelet, a specific shade of blue, be included in the tzitzit, the fringes that observant Jews attach to their garments. The exact species from which this blue was produced was lost sometime in the first millennium CE, probably as a result of the same disruptions that ended the broader Tyrian purple industry. For more than 1,000 years, observant Jews simply wore white fringes because the correct blue was unavailable, with the requirement for techelet suspended by rabbinic ruling until the original source could be rediscovered. In the 19th and 20th centuries, several researchers argued that the correct source for techelet was the same murex snail, specifically Hexaplex trunculus, that produced Tyrian purple, and that the blue variant of the dye, rather than the purple, was what the biblical text required. This argument, initially controversial, has gained substantial scientific support from chemical analysis and experimental production. An organization called the Til Techelet Foundation in Israel has been producing techelet from Hexaplex trunculus since the late 20th century and a growing number of observant Jews are now wearing techelet fringes produced by essentially the same process that the Phoenician dyers used for their purple 3,000 years ago. It is a remarkable loop in history. A dye technology developed by Phoenician merchants in the Bronze Age, suppressed by Roman imperial policy in late antiquity, forgotten in the early medieval period, recovered by modern chemistry and experimental archaeology, and now being used by practicing Jews to fulfill a biblical commandment that predates the destruction of the First Temple. The snails are still out there in the Mediterranean. The chemistry has not changed. The process is the same. The only thing that changed was the knowledge, and the knowledge came back. There is a curious thing that happens when you read about the Phoenicians for long enough. You begin to notice their absence in the places where you would expect them to be present. They are not in the standard popular histories of the ancient world. They do not have the cultural presence in popular imagination that the Greeks, the Romans, or the Egyptians have. There is no equivalent of the Asterix comics for Phoenicians, no Hollywood epics about Tyrian merchants, though Hannibal has attracted some attention. No popular mythology of Phoenician heroes and heroines that lodges in the cultural memory the way the Odyssey or the Aeneid does. Part of this absence is the problem of sources. The Phoenicians left us no literature in their own language, no history written from their own perspective, no philosophical tradition to engage the modern reader. What they left was commercial and physical. Harbour facilities, shell-midden heaps, purple dye residues in ancient cloth, thousands of votive stelae with names and brief dedications, the archaeological traces of an industrial civilization that did its work and moved on. These traces are extraordinarily rich by the standards of ancient archaeology, but they do not lend themselves to the kind of narrative popularization that the Greek myths or the Roman epics do. Part of it is the distortion of the ancient sources. For 2,000 years, the primary textual frame through which the Phoenicians were understood was the hostile frame of their competitors and conquerors, the Greek literary tradition that emphasized their commercial cunning and moral flexibility, the Roman rhetorical tradition that used Carthage as a byword for barbarism, and the biblical tradition that portrayed the Canaanites as a people whose destruction was divinely mandated. All of these frames had specific historical and ideological purposes that had nothing to do with providing an accurate or sympathetic portrait of Phoenician civilization, and the portrait they collectively produced was correspondingly skewed. And part of it is simply the nature of what the Phoenicians chose to do. They were not empire builders in the Roman sense, not philosopher kings in the Greek sense, not pyramid builders in the Egyptian sense. They were merchants and sailors and craftspeople. They built harbours rather than temples, ships rather than monuments, commercial networks rather than marble cities. The physical traces of their civilization are less spectacular on average than those of Egypt or Rome, because their civilization expressed itself in wood and cloth and dye rather than stone. The things they built that most expressed their genius, their ships, their trade routes, their commercial relationships, leave minimal archaeological trace. The genius itself is real. The evidence is difficult. But perhaps the most important reason for the Phoenicians' relative obscurity in popular historical consciousness is the very nature of their greatest achievement. The alphabet is so ubiquitous, so completely integrated into the fabric of literate civilization that it is nearly invisible. We do not think about where the letters came from when we read a novel or send a text message any more than we think about where the air came from when we breathe. The alphabet has become, in the 3 millennia since Phoenician merchants first spread it across the Mediterranean, as natural and as unremarkable as the act of breathing itself. The Phoenicians, in giving us this gift so completely and so thoroughly, made themselves invisible within it. There is something both poignant and appropriate about this invisibility. The Phoenicians were, above all else, people who understood the value of connections. between cities, between peoples, between products and markets, between knowledge and opportunity. The alphabet is the ultimate connection technology, the thing that allows any human mind to communicate with any other human mind across any distance of space or time, to build on others' knowledge rather than starting from scratch, to transmit the accumulated wisdom of one generation to the next without loss. In giving the world this technology, the Phoenicians did not attach their own name to it. They simply released it into the world and let it do what they had always known commerce would do, given freedom and time, spread everywhere, transform everything, and make the world richer and more connected than it had been before. The civilization that built itself on the purple dye and the cedar trade and the courage to sail beyond the known world did not ultimately leave behind a single monument to itself. It left behind something far more lasting. The letters you're reading right now, the commercial institutions that organize the global economy, and the deep-sea navigational tradition that eventually carried human beings to every corner of the earth. Not bad for a people who smelled of rotting snails. Let us return now to the purple, because we have been circling around its full economic significance without quite examining it directly. The Tyrian purple trade, at its height between roughly 1000 and 300 BCE, was almost certainly the most profitable single commodity trade operation in the ancient world. More profitable per unit weight than gold, more strategically significant than timber, more culturally powerful than any other textile. Understanding how it worked, from snail to throne room, requires following the supply chain from its most unglamorous beginning to its most exalted end. The snails were gathered in coastal waters, primarily along the Lebanese and Israeli coast, but also as eastern Mediterranean populations declined from overexploitation, from sources as far away as western Sicily, the Tunisian coast, and the Atlantic shores near Gerdir. The gathering was done primarily with baited traps, wickerwork or net baskets weighted with stones, baited with fish or other shellfish, and lowered to the sea bottom in areas where murex populations were known to concentrate. Archaeological evidence from ancient harvesting sites shows that the snails were collected in enormous quantities, and the shell-midden deposits that mark the locations of ancient dye workshops are among the most physically impressive archaeological features of the Phoenician world. At Sidon, at Tyre, at Acre, at Athlit on the Israeli coast, and at colonial sites throughout the Mediterranean, these midden heaps of crushed murex shells survive to astonish modern visitors with their scale. The production facilities themselves were carefully organized. The crushed snail material was placed in large lead-lined or ceramic vessels. Lead's impermeability and its resistance to the chemical reactions involved in the dyeing process made it the preferred vessel material, and the mass was allowed to ferment, typically for 3 days, which ancient sources specify with some consistency. The fermented material was then heated, typically for 3 days more, while impurities were skimmed off and the liquid was reduced. The resulting concentrate was the raw dye, a dark, opaque, foul-smelling liquid that had by this point completed its colour transformation through the sequence of pale yellow, green and blue to arrive at the deep purple red that made it valuable. Dyeing the actual cloth required immersing it in the heated dye bath, removing it, exposing it to air and sunlight to develop the colour, and then re-immersing it, a process repeated multiple times to achieve the desired depth of colour. The richest, most expensive grades were achieved by dyeing the cloth first in one species output, and then in another's. Combining the secretions of Hexaplex trunculus and Balinus brandaris gave different colour registers than using either alone, and by using additional processing steps that concentrated the chromophore and enhanced its affinity for the wool or linen, fibres. The textiles produced from this process were almost exclusively wool in the ancient world. Wool's natural protein structure, keratin, has a strong chemical affinity for the 6,6'-dibromoindigo chromophore and produces the most saturated, most brilliant colours. Linen, flax fibre, could also be dyed, but the colour was somewhat less vivid. Silk, which entered the Mediterranean luxury textile market from the Hellenistic period onward, took Tyrian purple with extraordinary beauty and became, in the Roman imperial period, the ultimate luxury textile, purple-dyed Chinese silk, whose price was essentially unconstrained by any economic logic except the desire of the buyer to display wealth without limit. The distribution of Tyrian purple cloth followed the commercial networks that Phoenician merchants had established throughout the Mediterranean and the Near East. Egyptian pharaohs, Assyrian kings, Babylonian and Persian courts, Mycenaean palaces before the collapse, Cypriot, kings, Greek tyrants and later Hellenistic kings. All of these were consumers of purple-dyed cloth, and all of them paid premium prices for the best quality. The Egyptian records mention true purple cloth in inventories of royal goods, distinguishing it from cheaper imitations. Assyrian tribute records list purple cloth alongside silver and gold as the highest value portable goods. The palace at Mari on the Euphrates, dated to around 1800 BCE, contains records of purple-dyed textiles in its inventory, evidence that the prestige of the colour extended far into the continental interior, well beyond the reach of any Phoenician ship. The price structures involved are difficult to reconstruct with precision, because ancient price data is fragmentary and economically contextual in ways that make direct comparison treacherous. But the available evidence suggests that the finest Tyrian purple cloth sold for somewhere between 10 and 20 times the price of undyed cloth of the same quality, and that pure dye concentrate was worth approximately its own weight in silver. The Roman Emperor Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, issued in 301 CE when the Roman purple industry was still operating at significant scale, lists purple-dyed silk at roughly 150,000 denarii per pound, in a price list where a labourer's daily wage was about 25 denarii. At that exchange rate, a pound of purple silk represented about 16 years of a labourer's daily income. Even allowing for the massive inflation that affected the late Roman economy and makes these numbers difficult to interpret in absolute terms, the relative price relationship is clear. Purple cloth was beyond the reach of virtually the entire population and accessible only to the very wealthiest individuals and to institutions, churches, palaces, temples that could concentrate resources at scale. This extraordinary price premium was maintained not only by the genuine difficulty and cost of production, but also by deliberate commercial strategy. The Phoenicians and later the Carthaginians were careful not to oversaturate the market with purple-dyed goods, maintaining the perception of extreme scarcity even when production capacity could theoretically have been expanded. They also maintained quality differentiation with remarkable precision. Ancient sources distinguish between multiple grades of Tyrian purple with the kind of connoisseurship that modern wine critics apply to vintage wines, and the premium grades commanded prices that bore almost no relationship to the cost of production, but were instead determined entirely by status signalling and the psychology of exclusivity. The trade routes through which purple cloth moved from the dye workshops of Tyre and Sidon to the throne rooms of Egypt, Assyria, and beyond are fascinating to trace, because they functioned on multiple levels simultaneously. At the simplest level, there was direct Phoenician export, ships carrying bales of purple-dyed cloth directly from Phoenician ports to Egyptian ports, to Cypriot ports, to Aegean ports, to the Italic and Sicilian colonies. But there was also a substantial overland dimension. The purple cloth that reached the courts of Babylon or Susa in Persia almost certainly travelled by caravan through the Syrian steppe and the Mesopotamian plain, handled by intermediary merchants, Aramaean caravaneers, Assyrian traders, who bought from Phoenician sources and sold into the continental interior at further price markups. The social life of purple cloth in these far-flung destinations was as important as its commercial life. A garment of Tyrian purple arriving at an Assyrian palace was not merely a luxury item. It was a statement about the king's ability to command the resources of the entire Mediterranean world, a tangible demonstration of imperial reach and commercial dominance. The ability to give purple as a gift was itself a form of power. It meant you had access to something that almost no one else could obtain. Assyrian kings gave purple cloth to subordinate rulers as marks of favour, creating a patronage network in which the colour itself became a medium of political communication. The same pattern repeated in Persian, Hellenistic, and eventually Roman contexts. Purple cloth as diplomatic gift, as reward for loyalty, as marker of rank and status in an elaborate hierarchy of precedence and privilege. And always, at the source of all this political theatre, the men and women in the dye workshops of Tyre were doing their aromatic, unglamorous, extraordinarily profitable work. The Phoenicians have sometimes been portrayed, particularly in older scholarship, as a people defined entirely by commerce, practical, pragmatic, focused on profit without a rich inner religious or intellectual life. This portrayal is both unfair and inaccurate, and it tells us more about the biases of 19th century European scholarship than about the actual character of Phoenician civilization. The Phoenicians had a rich and complex religious tradition that was deeply entwined with their commercial and maritime life, and that influenced, through various channels, the religious traditions of the Greeks, the Romans, and ultimately the monotheistic religions that emerged from the broader Canaanite world. The Phoenician pantheon was organized around a set of deities whose names and attributes varied somewhat from city to city, but whose underlying structures were broadly consistent. Every Phoenician city had a patron deity. Tyre's was Melkart, literally king of the city, a god of urban civilization, sea voyaging, and the cycles of the natural world, who was identified by the Greeks with Heracles and by the Romans with Hercules. Sidon's patron was Eshmun, a healing deity identified with the Greek Asclepius. Byblos worshipped Balat Gebal, the Lady of Byblos, a great goddess who had strong connections to the Egyptian goddess Hathor and was venerated as a patroness of fertility, love, and the sea. Astarte, the great goddess whose name gives us the Greek Aphrodite through a complex etymological path, was worshipped throughout the Phoenician world and was one of the most important deities in the Phoenician pantheon, a goddess of love, war, and the sea whose cult spread throughout the Mediterranean world in the wake of Phoenician commerce. The most famous male deity in the broader Canaanite world, though his specific cult role in Phoenician cities is somewhat complex, was Baal, literally Lord, whose worship appears throughout the Hebrew Bible in the context of Israelite polemic against Canaanite religious practice. The Baal of the Hebrew Bible is a composite figure, probably conflating several different local deities who shared the title Baal, but the underlying deity is a storm and fertility god whose dramatic mythology, dying and rising with the seasons, doing battle with the sea god Yam and the death, God Mot, bringing rain and agricultural abundance, has been extensively documented through the Ugaritic texts discovered at Ras Shamra in Syria in 1929, which transformed our understanding of Canaanite religion by providing an actual Canaanite literary source rather than only the polemic of their neighbours. The Melkart cult in particular deserves extended attention because it is one of the most important religious exports of Phoenician civilization. Melkart was believed to die annually and to be resurrected annually, a pattern common in Near Eastern mythology for deities associated with the natural cycle of vegetation and agriculture. and his annual awakening was celebrated with a ritual that ancient sources describe as the Exercis, the awakening. The specific content of this ritual is not entirely clear from our sources, but it involved fire, which connects it to the god's association with the sun and with the hearth of the city. When Tyrian merchants established their colony at Gadir on the Atlantic coast of Spain, one of the first things they built was a temple of Melkart, and ancient sources describe it as one of the holiest sites in the western Mediterranean. When Heracles, the Greek hero with whom Melkart was identified, was said to have planted his famous pillars at the western end of the world, the pillars in question were understood in antiquity to be the Strait of Gibraltar, and the sanctuary that stood near them was the Temple of Melkart at Gadir. When the Carthaginian general Hannibal prepared for his crossing of the Alps and his invasion of Italy in 218 BCE, he first made a pilgrimage to the Temple of Melkart at Gadir to pray for divine support and to sacrifice. The religious geography of the Phoenician world was thus coextensive with its commercial geography. The temples of Melkart in Tyre, in Cyprus, in Sicily, in Sardinia, in Gadir, and in Carthage itself formed a sacred network that mirrored and sanctified the commercial network of which they were a part. This connection between commercial and religious space was not incidental. Temples in the ancient world were not simply places of worship in the modern sense. They were also repositories of wealth, archives of commercial contracts, centres of commercial dispute resolution, and sometimes directly involved in trade as institutional actors. The Temple of Melkart in Tyre almost certainly played all of these roles, serving as a kind of combination of bank, legal court, and place of worship in a way that was entirely normal in the ancient Near East, but sounds strange to modern ears trained to separate religion from commerce. When Phoenician merchants swore oaths before the god to guarantee commercial contracts, when they dedicated portions of their profits to the god as ex votos, when they inscribed dedications on the temple walls recording their commercial successes, all of these acts bound the religious and commercial worlds together in ways that made the god a participant in the trade network rather than merely its divine patron. The sacred prostitution that some ancient sources attribute to Phoenician temples, and particularly to the Temple of Astarte, is another contested topic that deserves careful handling. Greek and Roman sources, particularly Herodotus and Strabo, describe rituals at certain temples in the Phoenician world in which women served as sacred prostitutes, offering sexual services to worshippers as a religious act. Modern scholarship has become considerably more skeptical about these accounts, not because the ancient sources are necessarily lying about something they witnessed, but because the interpretation of what they witnessed may have been filtered through a Greek framework that systematically misunderstood Near Eastern ritual practices. The consensus today leans toward viewing these accounts as partially or substantially distorted, either misunderstandings of legitimate ritual practices or, in some cases, projections of Greek fantasies about Eastern sexuality onto the more complex reality of Phoenician religious life. This does not mean that Phoenician religious practices were all serene and uncontroversial by any standard. The Tophet debate, as we have seen, suggests that some of them may have been genuinely disturbing by any measure, but it does mean that the ancient sources need to be read with considerable critical care. What emerges from a balanced reading of the evidence is a picture of Phoenician religion as a sophisticated and internally coherent system, deeply embedded in the maritime and commercial life of the cities, connected through trade routes and colonial networks to the religious traditions of every civilization the Phoenicians contacted, and in turn influencing those traditions in ways that rippled through subsequent religious history. The Canaanite mythology, documented in the Ugaritic texts, forms part of the background against which biblical monotheism defined itself. Many of the religious innovations of the Hebrew prophets make most sense as deliberate rejections of, or responses to, precisely the kind of Canaanite religious practice that the Phoenician cities represented. The Phoenicians, in other words, were not only giving the world the alphabet and the purple dye and the navigational techniques, they were also, without intending to, providing the theological foil against which monotheism sharpened its arguments. No discussion of the Phoenician legacy can avoid Hannibal, even though he was Carthaginian rather than Phoenician in the strict sense, because Hannibal was, in an important way, the fullest expression of everything the Phoenician commercial empire had built. He was the product of a civilization that had been shaped by centuries of Phoenician commercial and cultural transmission, and his campaign against Rome was, in its deepest historical logic, an attempt by the Western Phoenician world to prevent the Roman expansion that was systematically dismantling Carthaginian commercial power in Sicily and Iberia. Hannibal Barca was born around 247 BCE in Carthage, the son of the general Hamilcar Barca, who had led the Carthaginian forces in Sicily during the final phase of the First Punic War. The Barca family, Barca means lightning in Phoenician, was one of the great military and political dynasties of Carthage, and Hamilcar was one of the most formidable commanders of his generation. The story that Hannibal told about his childhood, that he had begged his father to take him on campaign when he was 9 years old, and that his father had agreed only after extracting an oath that Hannibal would be an eternal enemy of Rome, is probably legendary, but it captured something real about the intensity of the Barca family's commitment to the conflict with Rome. After the First Punic War ended with Carthage's defeat and its loss of Sicily in 241 BCE, Hamilcar led the Carthaginian effort to rebuild the empire's resources by conquering much of the Iberian Peninsula, the territory that is now Spain and Portugal, and exploiting its mineral wealth, particularly the silver mines. He took the young Hannibal with him, and Hannibal grew up in Iberia, learning military command under his father and then under his brother-in-law Hasdrubal, who succeeded Hamilcar after his death in 228 BCE. When Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BCE, the army elected Hannibal, then 25 or 26 years old, as his successor. The sequence of events that led to the Second Punic War is complex, involving the city of Saguntum on the Spanish coast, Roman diplomatic overreach, Carthaginian strategic calculation, and the kind of mutual provocation that great powers engage in when they have both decided that war is probable and are positioning for the best starting conditions. What matters for our narrative is what Hannibal did next, which was so audacious that it has never stopped astonishing military historians. In the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal marched his army out of Cartagena in southern Spain, the city that was the centre of Carthaginian power in Iberia, with approximately 100,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and somewhere between 37 and 40 war elephants, depending on which ancient source you believe. His intention was to invade Italy by marching overland through Gaul and crossing the Alps. This was considered so impractical by the Romans, who were already mobilizing their legions for what they assumed would be a naval war against Carthage, that they did not seriously prepare for it. Iberia was a long way from Italy, and crossing the Alps was something that no army had ever done. They were the northern wall of Italy, the barrier that protected the rich Po Valley and the peninsula beyond. Hannibal crossed them. The crossing took approximately 15 days in the late autumn, when the high passes were already acquiring their winter snowpack. The army suffered catastrophically from the cold, from altitude sickness, from rock falls triggered by hostile mountain tribes, and from the sheer physical difficulty of moving tens of thousands of soldiers and dozens of elephants through terrain that would have challenged a modern mountaineering expedition. By the time Hannibal descended into the Po Valley, he had lost roughly half his army. Ancient sources suggest he crossed the Alps with around 26,000 men, down from roughly 100,000 who had started the journey in Spain. Most of the elephants had died. The men who survived were exhausted, sick, and underfed, and yet from this depleted starting position, Hannibal spent the next 15 years defeating Rome in Italy. The battles of Trebia in 218 BCE, Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, and most famously Cannae in 216 BCE were among the most complete military victories the ancient world records. At Cannae, Hannibal destroyed a Roman army of somewhere between 50 and 70,000 men in a single afternoon, using a tactical maneuver, a deliberate weakening of his centre to draw the Romans forward while his flanks closed around them. That is still taught in military academies today as the paradigmatic example of the double envelopment. The Romans lost more men killed at Cannae in a single day than the United States lost in total during the Vietnam War. Rome did not surrender. This is perhaps the most remarkable fact in the entire story of the Punic Wars. After Cannae, after having lost 3 major battles in successive years, after watching a Carthaginian army march through the Italian countryside from the Alps to the toe of the boot, Rome refused to negotiate. The Senate rejected peace feelers. The city raised new legions from its remaining manpower. The Roman political tradition of the time specifically forbade any senator from even discussing peace terms while an enemy army was on Italian soil. And the prohibition held. It held for 16 more years. Hannibal never took Rome. The reasons are debated endlessly by military historians. He did not receive the reinforcements and supplies from Carthage that he repeatedly requested, and that would have allowed him to prosecute a siege. His Gallic and Spanish cavalry were superb in open battle, but he had almost no siege equipment or expertise. The Roman allies in Italy, despite defections after Cannae, mostly held firm to Rome, denying Hannibal the comprehensive strategic support he needed. And Rome's strategy, largely attributed to the general Quintus Fabius Maximus, of avoiding pitched battle while striking at Hannibal's supply lines and intercepting detachments, gradually ground down the Carthaginian force without giving it the decisive engagement it needed. Eventually Rome took the war to Carthage itself. The general Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, landed in North Africa, and Hannibal was recalled from Italy to defend his home city. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio defeated Hannibal in a straight-up tactical engagement, the first time Hannibal had ever been beaten in open battle, and Carthage was forced to sue for peace on humiliating terms: loss of its Spanish territories, reduction of its navy to 10 ships, payment of an enormous indemnity, and a prohibition on making war without Roman permission. Hannibal survived Zama. He became a Carthaginian magistrate, tried to reform the city's finances to pay the Roman indemnity more efficiently, and was forced into exile when his political enemies accused him to Rome of plotting with the Seleucid king Antiochus III. He spent his remaining years as a general for hire and a political advisor to various Eastern Mediterranean rulers who were resisting Roman expansion, always looking for a way back, never finding one, and died by his own hand, poisoned with a ring he kept for the purpose. Somewhere around 183 BCE, unwilling to fall into Roman hands alive. The Plutarch version of his final words has him noting with characteristic dark wit that Rome must be in need of a rest, since she had been waiting so long to kill one old man. Carthage survived Hannibal by 37 years, until the Third Punic War and the city's total destruction in 146 BCE. The city that fell in that year was no longer a military power. Rome had stripped it of everything dangerous. It was a prosperous trading city, its harbours still busy, its merchants still working the networks that their Phoenician ancestors had established centuries before. It was destroyed anyway, because Rome had decided, with Cato's relentless urging, that Carthage's existence as a prosperous commercial centre was itself a threat. that the wealth generated by Phoenician commercial tradition was an implicit challenge to Roman supremacy that could not be tolerated. Rome burned the city, demolished its walls, and sold its surviving population into slavery. Then, in one of history's more pragmatic reversals, the Romans rebuilt Carthage as a Roman city, and the rebuilt Carthage became one of the great cities of the Roman Empire, an important centre of North African commerce and later of Christian theology, producing Augustine of Hippo, among others. The harbour that the Carthaginians had built so carefully continued to be used for centuries. The commercial networks that Phoenician merchants had established continued to function, now under Roman management, carrying goods, including of course purple cloth, across the same sea routes that Tyrian ships had pioneered. The empire changed, the commerce endured,